One of the most ironic things about my conviction with anti-natalism is that Christianity further ingrained it within me. I'll explain what I mean by that. For most of my life, I was a Christian. I went to church, I prayed, I read the Bible, I did everything that you would think a Pentecostal would do. And if I'm honest, I would say that I was someone who actually enjoyed uh, my faith. I enjoyed being a Christian. By default, I've always been someone who was drawn to the spiritual. I've always been someone who was drawn to uh, the esoteric side of life, the esoteric mysteries of life, however you want to define that. I've always been someone who has been interested in the religions and the occult and so on and so forth. So Christianity, for the most part, fit me well because of my personality, because of my inclination toward these things, even as a child. But growing up, um, I had I would read the Bible and I would come across passages about hell, and I would go to church and I would hear sermons about hell, and it caused me to think, if I brought a child into this world and they, for whatever reason, didn't believe what I believed, they would go to hell forever and burn in fire because they didn't believe the same God that I believed in. And so I questioned myself, and this questioning actually led to a lot of different forms of questioning, which eventually led me out of the church. But this one question made me look, and I asked myself, would I be okay with my kid going to eternal torture simply because they don't believe the same thing that I believe about God? And of course, the answer was a resounding no within myself. I could not possibly do that. I could not possibly uh, enforce that kind of a gamble. And for me, the idea of hell was real. I wasn't like one of these, uh, word of mouth Christians. I was actually someone who genuinely believed the Bible. I believed every word of it. I was indoctrinated, and I believed that indoctrination. I fell straight in line with it. And so for me, the reality of hell was something that caused me to think about what I was going to do to my kid. And so I had determined in myself that since I could not guarantee that my child would believe the same things I believed, I wouldn't have a child. I would not enforce that gamble. I couldn't. But then something else happened. That questioning led me to another question. How is it that the Bible presents God as being eternally merciful, eternally good, and eternally forgiving, but would be able and willing to burn my child or anybody else's child in eternal fire forever over something as trivial as belief? Over something as trivial as that. And it caused me to question the morality of this God, the actions of this God. And so I went down the line and I began to read the Bible again in a way, and this new understanding of how I was beginning to perceive this God. And in a way of speaking, the blinders came off, right? Because I would read the Old Testament and I would stop and think about what I was reading. Before, I was just being obedient, reading these passages about God killing people and saying, oh, well, that's their fault. They were the enemies of God. They deserved it. But for whatever reason, something in me changed. And I was able to look at these scriptures and recognize there is something deeply wrong here. And this led me to questioning the motives of this God and why I should even bother worshiping it, let alone bringing someone else into this world and training it to worship it. And so all these questions led me to where I am today, to the point where I had to break. because even while I was inside of the church, I had anti-natalism within me before I even knew what anti-natalism meant. I knew that I wasn't going to impose the gamble of suffering, let alone eternal suffering, onto any child. I knew before I even learned what antinatalism was that I didn't want my kid to grow up in a world like this because life is just too unpredictable. And I knew that at a very early age, and it just grew and grew and grew. So when I turned 20 years old, that is when I officially denounced the Christian religion. I left it behind. I wanted nothing to do with the God that it worships. And since then, I've come across different ideas such as Gnosticism. And that really just blew my mind, because a lot of the things that are presented within Gnostic thought are the same similar thoughts that I have been having before I even got to the point where I found out about it. So it seemed like all these events in my life converged to a point where it took me to the place I am today. And truthfully, I can say that I'm glad that it happened, because I can't imagine my life being a willful slave to an unmerciful and evil God, and to a religion that has brought so much destruction and terror into the lives of so many. And I just didn't want to live my life that way. I couldn't live my life believing there was a merciful, good God. But then when I leave the church doors, I would go out into the world and see something that contradicted the entire thing that the Bible taught. I would sit in church and I would listen to the pastor harp on and on about how good God is and how merciful God is. And everybody would just say amen and agree and, stand up and applaud and praise God. But then I would leave the church and look at the world around me. And it set in, and it began to set in over time, that there was something that wasn't right with that picture. How is it that we are presented a God who is good and everlastingly loving, but when I look outside of the church and when I walk down the street, I can see the suffering as clear as day. I can see people crying and people in pain and sorrow and agony that is happening in the lives of millions every single day. I can turn on the news and see the horror happening, and nothing is being done to help. There is no divine intervention being done to help people in the now. There is no divine intervention being done to relieve humanity of the weight of suffering that is imposed upon us. So I reasoned that God can't possibly be good. There can't possibly be an all-loving God ruling over this planet. So all of these questions, all of these contradictions that I began to recognize further strengthened my anti-natalist conviction, to the point where now I can say anti-natalism is not just simply a philosophy that I have. It is a genuine belief of strong conviction. There is no way that I can possibly bring another child into this world knowing what I know about life, knowing what I know about, the tragedies that happen and can happen at any given moment. I don't feel comfortable imposing the gamble. For me to bring a child into this world would be the ultimate torture. I would torture myself. I would hate myself with absolute hatred if I were ever to make that kind of a mistake. To know better and then to still do it will be worse than committing any crime that I could possibly think of. I take this serious. If there were such a thing as sin, I would say that bringing a child into this world is the only abomination that I could never forgive myself for. I could never forgive it. I would rather commit suicide than to impose life onto another being, because life is inherently awful. And I know there are good things in life. I know there are good moments in life, but you have to really get beyond that to see the picture. You have to really look beyond that to see the background of what life is. Fundamentally, this place is terrible. Death is in everything. Suffering is in every sentient being. There is pain and tragedy that make up the backdrop of this place. It is full of imperfection and chaos. There is no real substance of good on this planet. It's not death is built into everything. Everything. So death and uncertainty. And so for me to bring a child into this would just tear me apart. I think that would be a worse fate than anything, to know that I committed that crime knowing better. That would keep me up at night. That would make me hate myself to the point where I would just lose my mind at what I had done. You know, people say, "Oh, mistakes happen." That's not a simple mistake, man. That's bringing somebody into the torture chamber. When you have a child, whether you know it or not, you brought them into a torture chamber. They are going to experience suffering. They are going to experience death. They are going to experience anxieties and depressions and all sorts of chaotic things that you can never predict. You can't protect your child from everything. And because I can't protect my child from everything and from these negative experiences, I can never make the mistake of bringing them here in the first place. And I don't have the audacity to try and justify it. I would thoroughly hate myself if I ever did something like that. Because it's just wrong, man. It's evil. All the shit we have to go through and all the shit that I've been through, I should know better. And I do know better, thankfully. So, you know, anti-natalism is a passion for me because truly I think that this philosophy is something that is so merciful. It is something that is so real to the situation. We know death and suffering exist, and we know that some people get it worse than others. And it really is a dice roll. Some people are born and they live relatively okay lives. As a matter of fact, I think that if you ask most people, they'll say, yeah, they're okay with being alive. I don't think they consider what that means. I don't think they consider all the components of that because, well, they live now in a state where they haven't suffered much. But at any moment, that can turn around and cause their fate to be bitter and give them a whole new perspective. But beyond the pleasures and beyond the setbacks, the absolute uncertainty of life is enough reason for anyone with a sense of empathy to say, I'm not going to impose this onto a child who I would say that I love. And I'm just so grateful that I came around to this point, even if it was kind of unorthodox the way that Christianity influenced, or rather further strengthened that idea in me. But I'm so glad that it did, because I would hate to be another average person who doesn't think about this thing and who doesn't allow it to set in what they're going to do the moment that they choose to have unprotected sex and impose a new being into this shit reality, this torture chamber, this 3D torture chamber. And so, I just wish that more people will wake up, and they are, thankfully, maybe one at a time, but whatever. I'm so thankful for every person who listens to the anti-natalist call, who hears any of our videos and see or read any of our posts and say to themselves that these people have a point, and that they can recognize logically that it's not worth imposing the gamble.